γιατί είμαστε ήδη συνδεδεμένοι με Αμερική. Professor Theriault, are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Προχωρούμε στη συνέχεια του συνεδρίου. Ο τίτλος του συγκεκριμένου πάνελ είναι «Η συμβολή της Διεθνούς Ένωσης Μελέτης Γενοκτονιών στην πρόληψη και την αποτροπή του εγκλήματος της γενοκτονίας. The contribution of the International Association of Genocide Scholars concerning the prevention of the crime of genocide». Ο ομιλητής, ο καθηγητής Henry Theriault, είναι καθηγητής φιλοσοφίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Worcester στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής. Διδάσκει γενοκτονικό αρνητισμό, πρόληψη γενοκτονιών, μεταγενοκτονικές σχέσεις μεταξύ θύματος και θήτη, επανορθώσεις, μαζική βία κατά των γυναικών που λαμβάνει η χώρα κατά τη διάρκεια γενοκτονιών. Είναι υπεύθυνος της ομάδας μελέτης επανορθώσεων για την αρμενική γενοκτονία και έχει δημοσιεύσει πάμπολα άρθρα και μελέτες αναφορικά με ζητήματα γενοκτονίας. Είναι πρόεδρος της Διεθνούς Ένωσης Γενοκτονολόγων ή Μελετητών Γενοκτονίας και σας υπενθυμίζω ότι η Διεθνής Ένωση Μελέτης Γενοκτονιών το 2007 ανεγνώρισε ότι οι διώξεις που έλαβαν χώρα από το 1913-14 μέχρι το 1923 κατά των Ελλήνων της Οθωμανικής Αυτοκρατορίας στο σύνολό τους συνιστούν γενοκτονία όπως αυτή ορίζεται στο διεθνές δίκαιο και γενικότερα στην ομολογία και στην γενοκτονολογική θεωρία. Ήταν μια πάρα πολύ σημαντική αναγνώριση γιατί προήλθε από τους καθήλυν αρμόδιους να κρίνουν κατά πόσο μια γενοκτονία είναι όντως γενοκτονία ή δεν είναι. Ήταν πολύ σημαντικός στη διαδικασία αναγνώρισης της γενοκτονίας και ο ρόλος του Israel Charney, που ήταν τότε μέλος της Διεθνούς Ένωσης Μελέτης Γενοκτονιών, του καθηγητή Adam Jones, της Θείας Χάλο και πολλών άλλων από εμάς, που τότε είχαμε ξεκινήσει ως μέλη της Διεθνούς Ένωσης και συμβάλαμε στο βαθμό που συμβάλαμε στην αναγνώριση και της γενοκτονίας των Ελλήνων. Professor Theriault, we are very honored to have you with us, and the floor is yours. We send you our warm greetings, cordial greetings from Athens. We are very sorry that you were not able to come. Nevertheless, we are hugely honored to listen to you via Skype. Thanks God there is Skype, and we can have you with us in that way.
Thank you, and the honor is entirely mine. I'm so thankful to be included in this extremely important program that is looking at genocide, past, present, and unfortunately future. So I appreciate very much to be part of the program, and I also want to bring greetings from the International Association of Genocide Scholars. You have had a number of past members of the leadership participate in previous conferences, and they've also been, I think, very honored to have that role on behalf of our organization. I also would like to say I am thankful for the role of technology. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you for this. It's just my work duties and related issues just made it very difficult at this time of the year to do any kind of international traveling. But I'm very thankful that you were able to work out my participation and really, again, feel that the program that you're doing is very important and is something that needs to be part of global awareness today. So the issues I would like to cover really come out of genocide denial, but go beyond, I think, a lot of times what we think about in terms of denial. one of the truisms that's actually false about denial is that it's a discrete stage of genocide denial, that denial comes at the end of genocide as the sort of final part of genocide, and this sort of attempt to erase not just genocide, but also the people who were victimized through it, and the culture and society and so forth that were destroyed through genocide, to erase them from human history. While this is something that very much happens in the aftermath of genocide, denial happens at all stages of genocide, including in the sort of precursor or the lead up to genocide. As for instance, Muge Gocek has argued in the case of genocide in the Ottoman Empire, that denial started even before the actual main phase of the genocide. It continues all the way through genocide. Again, looking at the Ottoman Empire, there were active denial efforts all through the process of genocide. This continued in the second phase of genocide under the Turkish nationalist movement, 1919 to 23, which again saw victimization of the three main target groups, Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians in this process. And denial, as I'm sure you're well aware, has continued to this day with tremendous vigor, with millions of US dollars in resources, and diplomatic, academic, and other supports across the world. It is a very unfortunate situation, but something that in some sense has defined modern Turkey internationally, contemporary Turkey internationally. So what I would like to suggest is that it's not denial that's the final stage of genocide. Denial is always present before, during, and after genocide, but consolidation of genocide. And by consolidation, I mean the end state of a genocide in which all its negative impacts on the victim groups and the benefits for the perpetrators become permanent norms of a new demographic, territorial, ideological, political, economic, territorial, cultural, military, social, and familial order. What I mean by that is that until the process of consolidation happens...
Professor Theriault, just a second. Did you have some slides to show during...
Oh, they're on my computer screen. I'm sorry.
Yes, can you share the screen as we did before?
Oh, how do I do that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, on the bottom of the Zoom window, there is a green icon, as we said, with an up arrow.
Yeah.
Okay, just press that.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. I apologize.
No worries.
And I'm sorry,
Yeah, just move the mouse and you'll see the green icon on the bottom of the screen.
I'm sorry.
It's titled
and share. Yes. Okay. Exactly. I am so sorry.
The desktop or screen, whatever is mentioned there.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, there we are. Okay.
There you are. Okay. I'm so sorry. I really apologize for that. I thought I had said it. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, again, my apologies for that. Again, going to consolidation, what this really means is in the aftermath of the main, destruction of a genocide, there still hasn't been a complete consolidation of the genocide. That is, there's still opportunities to prevent the full impact of the genocide on the victim group and the full benefits from going to the perpetrator group. In that stage, there can be efforts. Oftentimes we'll see, in the contemporary period, trials of major perpetrators, and then sometimes, as in the case of Rwanda, even lower level perpetrators. We'll see efforts at repair that can include material reparations and other things. I'll touch on that a little bit later. However, once the point of consolidation is reached, repair becomes virtually impossible. We enter a new stage for the perpetrator society, but also for the global, for the world order, in which the demographic, political, territorial, and other impacts of genocide become normalized. So for instance, if you look at the case of the Ottoman Empire, the erasure of Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians in effect from the Ottoman Empire and the later Turkish Republic become the norm of those societies. The residual communities that exist are marginalized, have no voice, and continue to be the fit subjects or objects of violence. This becomes a real challenge as time passes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The other important consolidation or problem of consequence of denial is what I call the embedment of genocide within the perpetrator society and culture. And there we see in all aspects of that culture and society, the political, military, economic, cultural, educational, social, and even at the family level, religious institutions and practices, at the level of both national and personal identity, and in the kind of ideology that is sort of the guiding set of principles for a society. We see that the genocidal attitudes, commitments, and other elements become part of the very way that the perpetrator society is organized and the way that it functions. This embedment is very deep and it's very powerful. So I'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. So going back to the consolidation of genocide, and let me just check in for a moment to make sure I'm not going too quickly. I know with translation this can be a challenge. Is everything okay with my pace? Okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't know about that, but
everything is okay, fine, Professor Theriault. Everything
okay.
is okay. It is going very smoothly. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. So while the ending of the active violence of a genocide is important, obviously, because that stops further destruction of the victim groups, it does nothing to address the harms that have already been done. And we can see, again, in the case of the Ottoman, Greek, Assyrian, and Armenian populations, the incredible devastation that was accomplished from 1913-14 to 1923. The ending of the process of genocide really comes when the genocidal process was successful. So already we're seeing, this deep harm that has the threat of becoming permanent. What's more than that, and this is very important to understand, is that unless these harms are addressed through specific actions, comprehensive trials, a political process that roots out the genocidal mentality and institutions and so forth that have become part of the perpetrator society, and probably most importantly, a reparative process that both helps the perpetrator group become rehabilitated, but also helps the victim groups in various ways through material, political, educational, and even symbolic components. Symbolic meaning things like apologies and statements of recognition and so forth. Unless there's this reparative process and these other elements, the impacts of genocide not only remain, but actually worsen and increase over time. And without going into details, because we don't have the time to do this, we see this in genocide for genocide victim groups again and again and again in the last hundreds of years, where even though the impacts of a genocide are tremendously devastating when they happen, they continue to play out over decades and even centuries, so that the victim groups are actually still being subjected to the consequences of genocide, even long after the world has sort of forgotten about or stopped focus on the genocide. Even though the violence of a genocide, as in the case of, say, Rwanda, could take just 100 days, what is done after the genocide could take 100 years to play out and even more. In the case of indigenous peoples in North and South America, we see the consequences still playing out of genocide that occurred 300, 400, even 500 years ago. As the impacts of these initial harms continually increase, we have to recognize that the future viability of victim groups decreases. And I'm sorry, there's a typo on my slide. And what we've seen with victim groups, and I'm thankful that in the case of Greeks from the Ottoman Empire, of Assyrians from the Ottoman Empire, and of Armenians from the Ottoman Empire, that the efforts and circumstances have allowed them to persist even 100 years after this tremendous initial violence. But for many groups, within decades or more, the groups themselves fade out of meaningful existence. What happens is their cultures are not sustainable, their demographics are not sustainable. The populations are either spread too far across the world without the kinds of mechanisms to preserve identity and to preserve even political impact and so forth. And these groups effectively fade. They may still be remembered, they may still have people identify as part of the groups, but the groups themselves really fade from the human family of cultures and societies that's so crucial. And I think it's important, in the words of Jermaine McAlpin, my colleague and co-author, that genocide over time does not heal all wounds, so to speak. It doesn't take care of the impact of genocide, actually quite the opposite. The impact of genocide increases over time. And even genocides that did not succeed initially in destroying the victim groups, over time can have that effect. And this is something that we ignore, unfortunately, too often in looking at the aftermath of genocides. So if denial is not the final stage of genocide, it is certainly essential to this process of consolidation. And we can see this in the post-UN convention period, but also even if we look at the May 24, 1915 declaration that those perpetrating genocide against Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians would be punished, and the fact that had very little effect, and ultimately Turkey as the Turkish Republic benefited greatly economically, politically, militarily, and even territorially from this process of genocide against these minority groups. Denial creates a popular doubt about the perpetrator's responsibility that undermines legal and political efforts to address the harms of genocide. It does this within the perpetrator society, but also outside of it. And it weakens the will of external actors who might even have intervened against genocide within a society. It weakens the resolve both of their government, but also of the population to follow through and really deal with the consequences of genocide. And again, I'm speaking to an audience that is surely familiar. If we look at the last 100 years, sort of post-genocide in the Ottoman Empire, we can see this weakening of resolve where governments that actually, these three governments and others that I mentioned, including the United States, very shamefully, have continued to not make good on the promises of accountability for the Ottoman Empire and Turkish Republic. Probably you've witnessed some of the things around the specific case of Armenians in the US Congress recently, where a very hopeful first step was taken in the House of Representatives, but it has been met with tremendous resistance at the Senate level and in the executive, which is unfortunately an old story in the United States. This power of denial is tremendous, and it has this effect. Most importantly, I believe denial provides an alibi for external, international, and national powers and institutions, including courts, for not addressing the issues of a genocide. That is, it allows external governments, the UN and others, to look good from a perspective of human rights and at the same time to do nothing about these past cases. What concerns me is that we actually can see denial of individual genocides resulting in a genocide denial in general. That makes it very hard within our global culture and global political order to deal with genocide, even contemporary genocides. Again, just to emphasize this, genocide over time becomes more of a problem, not less of a problem victims, even when the actual direct killing has stopped. As a side note, again, in the case of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, that violence has continued, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Just as harms are not undone by the mere end of a genocide, that is, that active phase, a perpetrator group does not suddenly become non-genocidal merely because it's completed its work of genocide. This is true even when, or maybe even precisely when, external forces have intervened. The attitudes, the practices, the structures of genocide that were endemic to the perpetrator society, government, military, and so forth, remain intact unless they're challenged by decisive efforts at justice and repair, and become deeply embedded within the post-genocide perpetrator order. We see this again looking at the Ottoman Empire in the case that many of the same people who perpetrated the genocide of the 1914-1923 period become major leaders in the post-genocide Turkish Republic, and in fact even help shape the new structures of the new, not just government, but of the society. They influence the academic culture, the political culture, the religious culture, and embed genocidal structures, attitudes, and so forth in them. As another colleague, Tabibi Tahemba, has put it, we have that saying in English, let sleeping dogs lie. In the case of the post-genocide world, the dogs of genocide merely sleep, but they're wakened very easily. And what we see is very frequently in cases of a genocide perpetrator, new groups and even subgroups of the perpetrator group become targets of these embedded attitudes, practice, and structures. And in fact, the logic of genocide that becomes part of a perpetrator society. And I want to stress, I'm not suggesting there's anything genetic or necessarily permanent about this. It's a very understandable process by which the educational system brings new members of the society into this logic of genocide, into these practices, and so forth. That this sort of structure of genocide, logic of genocide, actually continually seeks new victims by the very fact that it's part of this perpetrator society. Perpetrator societies, unless something is done, become perpetual perpetrators of genocide. I've used the term serial genocide perpetrators to capture that, and we see this again and again. Denial is crucial in this as well, because what it does within the perpetrator society is it prevents rehabilitation. It prevents a confronting of this past and an effort to actually change the internal workings of the society, of the ideology of the group, of its national identity, and even personal identity, which is influenced by this denial of national identity, where individual senses of self become dependent on a false history that's coupled with an attitude of entitlement to commit genocide, which I'll touch on in a moment. Denial becomes pervasive, and it warps the perpetrator society, allowing it to retain the features of genocide that were constructed in some sense through the process of genocide. While the genocidal ideology and so forth may predate the actual violence of genocide, that violence of genocide allows this violence to spread through all aspects of the society and to become part of the very structuring of society. You can think of an analogy, in the United States, we have things like fraternities at college that bring sometimes members more strongly into their fold through things like gang rape, where people, before they participate in this kind of violence, are not so tied to a negative kind of process, but through this violence become tied to it. Similarly with gangs, criminal gangs, the act of participating in murder, in violence, and so forth, helps force or mold newer members into those groups. And a similar process happens with perpetrator groups. That isn't to say that many people within the perpetrator groups don't resist this. They do. We see this in contemporary Turkey with many, many progressive Turks and others really fighting against this culture of genocide, fighting the prejudice that remains against Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians, and trying to stop the contemporary manifestations of this violence. So when groups, have become perpetrators without something to change them, to help them become non-genocidal over time in the aftermath of genocide, in some sense, they become even more genocidal. There are many obvious examples of this. We can see the persistence of Nazism in Germany and unfortunately in other places across Europe and in other places across the world as an example where this ideology and practice becomes deeply embedded. And although I would, commend Germany in many ways for its efforts to deal with the Holocaust, we do still see in political practices and so forth, some vestiges of Nazism in some aspects of contemporary society. I know that good-hearted Germans fight against this very strongly, but it is there, even in a case where there's been such an effort to denazify and to become progressive and take a very progressive leadership in the world. We see the violence by the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, the Hutu perpetrators in Rwanda, moving into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the same kinds of violence is continued as Congo has become destabilized. It's not only because of this, but the Hutu perpetrators who fled Rwanda after the genocide actually have become major forces of mass violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo and helped to establish a widespread culture of rape that has made the Democratic Republic of Congo referred to as the rape capital of the world. We see the sequence of genocide from the 1990s in Sudan. Sam Totten, as part of your program, has done tremendous work on this. From the Nuba Mountains through the process of Darfur and then back into the Nuba Mountains and other places today over a process of decades, where genocide that has been allowed to take place has resulted in this embedding under Omar al-Bashir, who thankfully was forced out of power recently, but over decades allowed him to continue genocide. We see this in centuries of genocide against indigenous peoples in South and North America, in Australia, and actually in other areas. And as I mentioned, we can see in some of the groups that have perpetrated these cases of genocide, a serial genocide perpetration where they continue again and again and again. The case of Turkey from 1914 and before, obviously, to 2019, and unfortunately, we're seeing very likely after 2019. We see the case of Turkey as extremely instructive in this way. It's a case that, in my opinion, in the last year, has become central to the future of humanity, because this legacy of genocide against Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians has now become a major threat to the Middle East and hence the world, that threatens to destabilize the Middle East further and introduce an international dynamic that extends the things that we've seen with ISIS and other forces within the Middle East, that extends them in time and I think in impact, so that we really are seeing something that is a true challenge to the global order. Turkey's invasion of Syria and the things that the mass violence it's perpetrating right there, right now, really represent a genuine global threat. Now, I've talked a bit about the embedding of attitudes and practices from the early, the first phase of this genocide in the Ottoman Empire, but we see the continued violence in 1919, 1923. Professor Veronis, who's I'm sure very well known to the audience, has done tremendous work, for instance, on the Greek labor battalions under the early Republican period, and the incredible genocidal destruction that continued. But we see a history of post-1923 continued violence through repression of these three minorities, but also others through economic, political, military, and religious means. Repression of freedom of religion, repression of educational institutions, and a continued threat of violence that we have seen, come up again and again. In the Armenian aspect, we certainly see the violent assassination of Hrant Dink as an example. Certainly in the case of Greeks, and also the relationship of Turkey to Greece as an extension of this genocidal mentality. We see the invasion of Cyprus and the occupation of part of Cyprus, and we see other examples as well. In the more contemporary period, other groups have been added to the main victims of the genocide a century ago. We see rampant anti-Semitism. You can see publicly displayed signs at demonstrations with swastikas. I think one of the most chilling is "Hitler got it right," a statement, by Turkish protesters in favor of the Holocaust. And we've seen this growing. We've seen these attitudes pervasive in the society, and we've seen them target especially Kurds. Although these other groups that I've mentioned, including Greeks, Armenians, and Syrians, are still targeted. Jews are still targeted. A consolidated military operation beginning in the 1980s to the present. Again, I apologize for the typo. I'm not super skilled with PowerPoint. I think I kept chopping off parts of my presentation. I apologize for that. And the latest example of this is Turkey's invasion of Syria, which, for those who have been following closely, really does take advantage of some of the same techniques, that eliminationist logic where here's a chance to get rid of the Kurds in areas of Syria so that they don't have the possibility of creating a territorial state, and the aggressive expansionism that, again, are very familiar to students of the genocidal process under the Ottoman Empire and the immediate aftermath of the Ottoman Empire. The fact that overall Turkish state and society is not even questioning the present opportunistic violence should give us true pause. It really is the demonstration of how deeply embedded these genocidal structures, attitudes, and ideologies have become in contemporary Turkey. Even a century after the main phase of this Ottoman/early Turkish Republic genocide, we see the same kinds of things spilling out. And I'm not being metaphorical. I'm being very, very concrete material when I talk about this, concretely material. We are seeing the same processes. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your kind and thoughtful attention. I'm sure I went over my time, but I'd be very happy to take questions and continue our discussion either right now, or certainly I'm available by email and in other means. Thank you again.
Ευχαριστούμε θερμά τον καθηγητή Theriault. Αν υπάρχει κάποια ερώτηση, θα ήθελα να ρωτήσω το τμήμα διερμηνίας αν μπορεί αυτό να επικοινωνήσει απευθείας με τον καθηγητή Theriault. Μπορεί οπωσδήποτε. Ξυπακούεται, ήταν ρητορική ερώτηση. Υπάρχει κάποια ερώτηση που θα θέλατε να υποβάλλετε στον καθηγητή Theriault, αναφορικά με τον αρνητισμό και τον αναθεωρητισμό των γενοκτονιών, τις επανορθώσεις και γενικότερα τα σημεία τα οποία έθιξε κατά την ομιλία του.
You mentioned anti-Semitism in Turkey, and especially with the rise of Erdogan. I'm from Israel, and I've been writing about Erdogan's anti-Semitism for over 10 years. Is this a sort of a telltale sign in certain societies, especially in the Islamic heartland, when you begin to see this type of anti-Semitism, especially the anti-Semitism that you mentioned, the lethal anti-Semitism or the eliminatory anti-Semitism, that a sign that these of potential genocide or what you described as a codification of genocidal structures, that it's much more embedded than we think, and the red flag is anti-Semitism.
I want to really thank you for that comment and question. I think one of the disturbing things about anti-Semitism is, although for many people in the world, the Holocaust became a moment that really challenged anti-Semitism and caused some people to become attuned to it and more actively resistant to it. I think at the same time, we see as the legacy of the Holocaust, unfortunately, an emboldening of anti-Semitism in some ways. And we see this as I think anti-Semitism was widespread globally before that. It's become universal. We see it in societies without Jews all the time. We can look at Malaysia blaming George Soros and then the quote-unquote Jews for the financial meltdown of the early 2000s. We see these kinds of things again and again and again. And I do think that when a society, when people in a society, and especially a government in a society, feels comfortable enough to voice these underlying attitudes and to sort of bring them to the public eye, to bring them to an international eye in some sense, without any concern about looking bad about what this means, I think we're in a very dangerous situation. Some of the things I've seen from Turkey are chilling in terms of the kinds of Nazi-focused anti-Semitism. And I think as soon as a group identifies in any way with Nazism, there are obviously many different forms of anti-Semitism. I think as soon as that connection is made, we are seeing genocidal anti-Semitism, that people are sharing those attitudes. I don't know if I've completely answered your question, but I think yes. I think this is an important warning sign. And I think if I can extend that a little bit, maybe part of the implication of your question is this sign of anti-Semitism also has implications for other target groups, right? So when we see a society committing itself to genocidal anti-Semitism, or at least when this is widespread in the society, does this mean that there's a broader pattern of genocide? And I think it's a good question. I don't think I can answer it based on research, but I think it's something for us to be looking at very carefully, because once, as we know, violence against one group starts happening, other groups are ready targets as well. And the history of the Holocaust shows this, and the history of other cases of genocide show this. So I think that's a very, very insightful point, and something we want to be very attentive to in Turkey and in other places where we're seeing yet more anti-Semitism in the contemporary world.
Να πούμε στον καθηγητή τον κύριο Κερίδη και μετά στον κύριο Βασιλιάδη και μετά στον κύριο εκεί.
Hi there. I very much enjoyed your presentation and the fact that you gave us a very important dimension of the issue, that is genocide denial feeds fascism and the anti-democratic illiberal forces in societies, and you make the connection with contemporary Turkey, which is always very important, especially for us here in Greece. I wonder, however, where do you stand in this very big debate if the matter of genocide denial is for the courts or for the public opinion and the public discourse to deal with it? As you know, there is a very brewing debate in Europe and in America about criminalizing that denial, and there are those who think this goes against free speech and kind of against the spirit of liberal democracy. So I wonder, where do you stand in this debate?
If anybody's interested, I've actually published something some years ago that was inspired by one of the participants, Israel Charney, who is well known to you, and his important work on the nature of genocide denial, the deep nature of genocide denial, and how it should be addressed through legal and other means. And I'm in agreement, I remain in agreement with him that I do think legal means are appropriate for dealing with genocide. It is not a free speech issue because genocide denial has genuine material impact. I suggested some of those in my comments, but I would go further in the article that I published. One of the things I highlighted, and it picks up something I touched on today, is that the impact of a genocide at the termination of violence is not completely set. Victim groups, for instance, even on members of victim groups, even on a personal level, a psychological level, have many different possible futures. And when a genocide is dealt with a vigorous process of justice and repair, that can lower the impact of genocide. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't change the incredible suffering or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. But it can prevent, at least at some level, the worsening over time of the impact of genocide. Genocide denial prevents that from happening. And what it does, as Israel Charney has talked about, it re-victimizes the victims. And I've actually argued it makes the violence that was initially perpetrated have even more of an impact. That is, denial is not about speech. It's about making actual violent acts even more devastating in their long-term impact. And for me, that makes it a material harm. And so all the questions in Western liberal legal and philosophical contexts about whether we can regulate speech, in my opinion, are irrelevant, because genocide denial it may be accomplished through words, but it is something that affects deep material harm, and therefore should absolutely be addressed. It needs to be addressed carefully, whether that it should be addressed through criminal law or some other process. My own position is those who deny genocide, particularly when it's widespread by a state and society, have an obligation not only to recant genocide denial, they should be legally required to do that, but they also have a very deep material, economic and resource-based, personnel-based responsibility to not only correct all the damage done, all the overcome all the lies told through denial, but to become the base to fund and to support education about these past genocides in profound and deep ways across the globe, including, most importantly, within their own society. They have that obligation, and if that needs to be enforced by courts to stop denial and to make them responsible for fixing what they have done through denial, then I think that should be enforced through courts. Unfortunately, this is a huge discussion. We could go on probably a whole other conference on this topic, and in fact, I'm on a panel, a very local panel tonight on this topic as well, looking at the new question about hate speech and genocide. So I would close there, except to say I highly recommend Israel Charney's work on this for those who are interested. He had some pioneering work in which he talks specifically about this. I'm happy to share my work. Terence Desprez also has a very important work on denial that I think supports some of these positions. So thank you for that great question.
Ευχαριστούμε τον καθηγητή κύριο Κερίδη για την πολύ σημαντική ερώτηση που έδωσε την ευκαιρία στον καθηγητή Θέριο να διευκρινίσει το θέμα της ποινικής καταδίκης του γενοκτονικού αρνητισμού, ιδιαιτέρως όταν ο γενοκτονικός αρνητισμός προέρχεται από τον θήτη και τα όργανα του θήτη. Διότι εάν δεν καταδικαστεί και ποινικά ο γενοκτονικός αρνητισμός του θήτη, θα επανέλθει εκ νέου ο αρνητισμός και ξανά θα δημιουργηθεί μια δυνητικά γενοκτονική διαδικασία, όπως την εξήγησε ο καθηγητής Θέριο. Θα ήθελα να δώσω το βήμα στον κύριο...
We could add one other thing, and again, this comes from Israel Charney, that the victims of genocide denial are not only the victims of genocide, it's also the members of the perpetrator society. They have a tremendous impact and have to deal with becoming deniers or fighting denial in their own society. It can warp people's minds, and it can marginalize those who are trying to do the right thing. So there's another dimension that's really important that makes me think that perpetrator societies would want to have genocide denial outlawed in the way that, for instance, Germany does about Holocaust denial. So sorry to jump in there, but I thought that was another important issue.
Μία τελευταία... δεχθούμε μια τελευταία ερώτηση, πάρα πολύ σύντομη. Παρακαλώ, κύριε Βασιλιάδη, δεν έχουμε χρόνο, πρέπει να
ρωτήσω λίγο.
Να τελειώσουμε
σύντομη.
Να σηκωθείτε λίγο όρθιο, σας παρακαλώ.
Ο κύριος Κολουμπαρέτσης μίλησε για αφηγηματική βία που οδηγεί πολύ πιθανόν, ας πούμε, και στη γενοκτονία. Το ερώτημα μου είναι, εάν η επιθετική προπαγανδιστική πολιτική του Ερντογάν και της Τουρκίας σήμερα έχει στοιχεία αφηγηματικής βίας, η οποία μπορεί να οδηγήσει και σε άλλες συνέπειες. Ευχαριστώ.
That's a really, really good and subtle question. What I would say is, because of the embedding of genocidal attitudes in Turkey so deeply, particularly within the political and military elites and institutions, that genocide becomes very easily possible. I am not, how should I say this? I believe that those attitudes and institutions are acting in a similar way to what happened a century ago. Whether what's happened in Syria at this point has risen to the level of genocide, you know, is something that people can debate. It's a question we really need to talk about. And but that said, I think we're on the path to that. I think that Turkey's just completely brazen disregard of human rights mean that we're on the path to genocide. And whether this will spill over into Turkish actions against other groups, whether we're going to see violence inside Turkey again, I think that's becomes even more possible with what we're seeing. And I also think it becomes a new norm when other groups, whether extremists or established governments, see what Turkey is doing and effectively, again, getting away with. I think it emboldens those elements as well. Even groups that are against Turkey politically may engage in their own mass violence that can become genocide.
Sorry, what do you think about the change of the vote?
Ένα λεπτό σας παρακαλώ. Δεν μπορείτε να παίρνετε μόνοι σας το λόγο. Είμαστε εκτός προγράμματος και εκτός
νομίζω
ωραρίου.
Ότι είναι σημαντική ερώτηση και υπεκφεύγεται αυτή τη στιγμή. Υπεκφεύγεται. Είναι σημαντική ερώτηση για την Ελλάδα αυτή. Πώς την κρίνει σαν καθηγητής? How you can estimate the change of the vote of the Congress of USA about the Armenians genocide? This is the question.
Professor Theriault, please reply. This is going to be the last question.
Okay, I'm happy to. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, how you can estimate the change of the vote on the USA Congress about the Armenians genocide, because it has to refer to the Greeks. So.
No, actually.
You mean should this also refer to the Greeks and Assyrians? Yes, it should. Absolutely. I don't want to somehow elide the difference in experiences of Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians. You know, Greeks, obviously, the phase of the genocide happens a bit earlier and extends in certain ways further in time. And I don't want to lose those kinds of subtleties. I think Assyria, without any kind of a homeland, Assyrians are in a particularly vulnerable position compared to Armenians and Greeks. But the overall genocidal process and the suffering of each of the groups was really obviously the same. It was one overarching genocidal process, and the devastating, horrific impact on the victims shared across the groups. And I think that should be reflected in any discussions of this case. And U.S. Congress, I think, unfortunately, it's a political body. In all honesty, although I welcome on a moral level the U.S. House of Representatives vote, I'm not naive to think that that wasn't aided in large part because of very clear political agendas to send Turkey a message that has to do with contemporary relations between the U.S. and Turkey. And in some, for some voting members, a lot less to do with the actual victims of the genocidal process 100 years ago. So I think, unfortunately, what we see in this case is a political process that unfortunately does not meet what I think you and many others would, including myself, would see as the ethical process that really should be followed. I hope that answers your question as well as I can. And I would add that IAGS, International Association of Genocide Scholars, really has taken this importance seriously, and many people within the organization, I think, have helped reshape the discourse so that we now refer to an Ottoman/Turkish Republic genocide against Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians, not the Armenian genocide or some other limited concept. So I hope that addresses your question. I did want to say in closing also to thank our moderator and also to recognize his tremendous scholarly impact and even on, I really have read his work with great interest and have been tremendously educated by his work. And I'm thankful that he's doing such important contemporary research. I just want to make a mention of that as well.
Thank you, Professor Theriault. We are really grateful for your fascinating discourse, lecture. We are looking forward to hosting you in another occasion here in Greece for another conference on the Ottoman genocides, and we wish you the best for the day.
Thank you so much. It's been tremendously rewarding and again, a tremendous honor to be with you. And I commend the work that you all are doing. This is just so important. And as I said, with what Turkey is doing now, the fact that and really shining a light on this history and the contemporary legacy is tremendously important for human rights today. So thank you. And for all that you're doing.
On a personal level, thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you for your work. It's really great.
Θα περάσουμε αμέσως στο επόμενο πάνελ με τον καθηγητή Τσάρνι και τον Μάθιο Γουίντελ. Απλά αναφορικά με το ψήφισμα της Βουλής των Αντιπροσώπων, το οποίο ενεκρίθη, αναφέρει στην δεύτερη παράγραφο και την γενοκτονία των Ελλήνων, των Ασσυρίων και άλλων χριστιανικών μειονοτήτων στην Οθωμανική Αυτοκρατορία. Οπότε, εμέσως πλην σαφώς το ψήφισμα της Βουλής των Αντιπροσώπων συνιστά αναγνώριση και της ελληνικής και της ασσυριακής γενοκτονικής περίπτωσης, διότι αναφέρει σαφώς ως συνθήματα, co-victims, και τους άλλους